is controlling the slides, and she and I are going to tell you today, give you a high-level overview about the recently approved invasive species management strategy that TRCA has produced, as well as the prioritization framework. Next slide, please. So this is just the outline. As I mentioned, we'll tell you a little bit about TRCA and the urban context, which we've heard some great presentations today on. The strategy's goal and objectives are actions and success criteria and the prioritization framework. Next slide, please.
Seems like there's a little bit of lag here. Apologies for that.
No worries. So TRCA is the largest conservation authority in Ontario by population, not by area. Our jurisdiction covers almost 3,500 square kilometers, so it's not the biggest, but it's still pretty darn big. TRCA is one of the largest landholders in the GTA, and we have more than 16,000 hectares of land under our ownership. Some of our property is under a management agreement with our partner municipalities, such as much of the land within the City of Toronto. And in those cases, it is the responsibility of the municipality to manage those lands. Where lands are not covered by a management agreement, TRCA bears the management responsibility, and some of these areas, particularly the upper reaches of the watershed, are among the most ecologically significant in the area. The jurisdiction covers a gradient of land uses from rural to urbanizing to heavily urbanized, which you can see in the photographs on the right. Next slide, please. So as we all know, people are responsible for the introduction of invasive species, and as such, the GTA, with its more than, I think I had in the last slide 4.3 million residents, but I think the update is closer to 6.2 million people, so it's a little outdated, but nevertheless, that makes the GTA a hotspot for invasive plant species. The images on the left show the images on the right show the urban and urbanizing areas. That's the dark and the medium gray areas. The light gray is indicated as rural. And the green shades show the natural heritage system as well as the potential natural heritage system, as well as the green belt and TRCA property. And the photo gives you a sense of the urban system with the various land uses, including residential areas, industrial areas, islands of green space. There's a rail corridor running up the middle of the photo, and sports fields, all of which contribute to the introduction and the spread of invasive plant species. In urban settings, oh, next slide, please. Excuse me one second. In urban settings, invasive plant species may provide important ecological function and services. And some of these photos illustrate how invasive species can do that. So they can provide direct habitat, including nectar sources and nesting locations. That's actually a photo of a least bittern nest in Phragmites. They provide a forage source, so we can think of round goby as a prey item, or for example, buckthorn berries that are eaten by birds. They often stabilize slopes and mitigate erosion, so you can see that slope of dog strangling vine that is being nicely held together by that plant. And in some cases, they may be the only natural cover available in some areas. So for example, the one photo shows Russian olive and Manitoba maple, which is really the only natural color. The other photo in the slide shows Phragmites along a shoreline. This is actually Grenadier Pond in High Park. And these plants do provide cover for wildlife. They also mitigate the heat island effects of the city, and they mitigate stormwater runoff. Also, because urban areas are highly altered and they may be subject to persistent and ongoing disturbances, the control of invasive species may not be feasible in terms of the resources required to achieve effective control and the very many other competing pressures and priorities of park and green space management. It may require years and years of dedicated control efforts to make a difference, and in some cases that's just not possible. And as alluded to in other presentations, especially the one that Jennifer Smith presented, we also experience amplified social concerns regarding invasives control. We hear lots of concerns about the use of herbicides and debate about the invasiveness or the nativeness of a species, as well as the real or perceived effects of invasives management. And all of this complicates invasive plant management in an urban system. Next slide, please. So TRCA has been managing invasive species for years, but we lacked an improved strategy to guide our efforts. So this strategy was approved last November, and what it does is it provides a high-level framework that guides invasives management on TRCA lands, as well as the monitoring, internal and external training and education, public engagement, as well as science and research into invasive species. Subsequent to the approval of the strategy, we will start work now on the development of site-specific invasive species management plans. So this is really where the rubber hits the road and we start saying exactly what we're going to do to deal with invasive plants within a given area. The strategy also, I will note, heavily references the Ontario Invasive Plant Council resources, including the best management practices and technical bulletins. And I don't think there's anything really that compares to the resources that OIPC provides. Next slide, please. So along with the objectives, we've also identified criteria to determine if the objectives are being successfully met. So I'm going to walk through an example. So in this example, the objective is eradication, containment, and control. The action identified here is to undertake strategic and targeted management of established high priority invasive species with other agencies and partners to eradicate, contain, and or control in natural areas owned or managed by TRCA as appropriate. And then to determine if we have actually succeeded with meeting that objective through our action, we've identified success criteria. So in this example, the success criteria for the eradication, containment, and control for Action 5 would be a decrease in invasive alien species richness. That's what IAS means. Sorry, I missed that abbreviation. And the extent within the properties owned and or managed by TRCA. So you're probably asking yourself right now, but Karen, how do you know what's a high priority invasive species? So the strategy is going to inform that. Included in the strategy is a task list for the successful implementation of the strategy, including the development of the prioritization framework that Namrata is going to tell you about.
Great segue. So I'm going to dive a little deeper into the prioritization framework. Before getting into the nuts and bolts of it, I just wanted to emphasize again what Karen has already mentioned, that why prioritization came out as one of the key action items from our strategy is mainly, again, related to all the impacts these invasive species have on not just the ecological and ecosystem function side of things that we ecologists often care about, but also some of the other ecosystem services that decision makers are wary of, and they need to incorporate that in their decision making, including infrastructure damage, human health challenges, and then damage to forestry, reduction in recreational values, and so on and so forth. So we definitely need to manage invasive species, but the challenge, like Karen already highlighted, is urban and near urban areas. We already have high levels of invasive species because of all these reasons listed here, we are so altered in landscape. We have such altered landscape that disturbances and dispersal pathways and just these seed sources are tremendous that makes it challenging to control invasive species. And on top of that, because of this widespread nature and the limited resources and competing priorities, we have highlighted that we need to be strategic. We need to identify where we need to go first, where and what we need to tackle first. And that's what we really try to do with this prioritization framework, where we are looking at, if we go back to this invasion curve, we need to consider all of this in terms of how much invasive species are present. Is it in the preliminary stages where it's small and localized, or just absent and we just need to watch for it, or it's in the widespread and abundant throughout the area, so that we are now aiming more for asset protection or protection of certain valued assets that we want to maintain over long term. And all of these objectives that we have in our strategy are dependent, and that is what we need to focus on as we develop our prioritization framework. So to develop this, we partnered with University of Toronto Scarborough Cadott Lab with Professor Mark Cadott and Luke Podgeter, Dr. Luke Podgeter, who's our postdoc, who has helped us develop this framework. And my tax kind of funded partially this project. And what we did was we went through a fine comb approach where we looked at a thorough literature review in terms of what other jurisdictions have been doing in similar setting, and then came up with the approach where we are taking a two-pronged approach, where we are looking at the species-based prioritization and area-based prioritization both. And then we developed the framework itself that could be applied to like a broader set of species, but then we focused our analysis more on the plants, terrestrial plant species, because of the data availability and the scope, the limited scope of the project at this time. And then we also engaged with stakeholders to get their input, which is still a work in progress. So I'm just going to walk you through some of our findings. As we looked at the literature review at a global scale, what we identified, just the take-home messages from this work, is that most of the frameworks for prioritization are designed for use in largely natural settings. So a lot of the criteria may or may not be applicable in highly altered landscapes like urban areas, especially where it is open to access for human use and so on and so forth. So that was one big challenge that we saw. Most of the frameworks focused on negative impacts of invasive species alone. And as Karen mentioned, in urban areas, we might need to consider that there might be some positive effects, especially where there might be no other natural area present or natural cover present. And the third point we saw was the spatial scale of assessment was mostly at larger scale, national scale, and so on. And then also there was increasing recognition that there is more complexity in IS management in urban areas, especially when stakeholder interest and various ecosystem services that these species might be providing, that makes it more complex in invasive species management decision making. So all of these provided guidance to developing our framework. And as we moved towards developing the framework, we focused on, again, like I said earlier, two-pronged approach. First, focused on species. So species-based approach basically identified priority invasive species based on best available information from both science and practice. This was data-driven, and the various information and methods from science was used, but also used stakeholders' practical sort of knowledge into that process as well. The area-based approach, however, focused on identifying strategic areas for management, again, kind of thinking about that asset-based management, mainly to protect those valued assets. And these are a combination of both data and expert input, as I'm gonna walk you through it. So just species-based approach, when we look at it, what we looked at, again, is development of framework itself, the broader framework. And we focus on plants at this time, but the framework could be adjusted and applied to broader group of species as well. So we based it on the framework proposed by Robertson et al. In 2003 that uses multiple criteria, and that has been used globally for various kinds of landscapes. And what this does is it looks at various criteria and creates these modules of those criteria and scores and ranks them. And that's what we did, but kind of adapted those that framework for our own TRCA needs. And in our case, we used 46 criteria. They were grouped into 8 broad modules that reflects all of these things that are listed here, that focuses on the status of invasion, habitat requirement of the species, biological characteristics, their positive, negative impacts, and potential for control, and all of these. And each of these criteria was scored with a criteria score based on what we know of the species, and a confidence score based on how much we know of it. So some we may be more certain, the others we may be less certain. And these were mostly used based on literature and sort of the scientific information on those species. And product of these 2 scores determines priority score for each species. And the intent was that each of the invasive species was going to walk through that framework. And to identify which species we are going to assess through the framework, we developed a candidate invasive species list. And this was based on the TRCA list of species that we have recorded and some of the other lists that as I've shown here. And we also consulted with stakeholders to get any species that were missing from that longer list. And then in total, we ended up having 50 species that we call candidate species list. That basically included all of those highest occurring species in those databases and from input from the stakeholders. And we walked each of them through the scoring and ranking process of the framework. And then once each of the species were given the priority score, and then we were able to rank in terms of which one has the highest score versus lower score. And this list, we kind of had some initial consultation with our key stakeholders to see what needs to be done to refine the method. And this is still work in progress as we work through this refinement. And when you look at this framework, then what we have is the spreadsheet, which lists all of the criteria and the modules, and it allows us to provide sort of the ranks or scores for each of it. And each score is already predefined. So for anyone who's using this spreadsheet, it's easy to decide what to put. And in terms of confidence, again, you can go from 0 to 1 in terms of how definite you are in terms of your input. And ultimately, you get sort of the combined score of all of these criteria that gives that total score for each species. So that's what it looks like. And then we've come up with basically these 50 species that have been ranked as our priority species. Obviously, dog strangling vine comes as the first one here, not surprisingly. But we are still undergoing some of the refinements based on what TRCA needs are, and maybe some of the stakeholder and other expert inputs and needs. So that's for the species-based. In terms of area-based approach, having a species list is one thing, but then also knowing where to go is another thing, given the large area our jurisdiction covers. So we focused on, again, protecting ecosystem function and services from the impacts, and then collated these broad group of criteria, the total of 30 criteria, but they were sort of grouped into 2 major themes. The first is biodiversity and ecosystem functions. So you can call it these ecological criteria mostly. And then there are other ecosystem services. And this is where we used some of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment sort of grouping of what services do we value kind of thing. So we grouped them together and we overlaid all of these criteria into a multi-criteria analysis method in GIS to identify where we get the hotspots for management. And at this point, we have equal weights placed on all criteria, which obviously can be moved and moved around if we want to place higher weights on certain criteria versus others.
Namrata, sorry, we really have to, if you can just wrap up in a minute, we're just time crunched. We have a hard stop at 5. I have to shut down the system.
Yeah, so I only have a few, 2-3 more slides.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
Yeah. So the area-based, so this is what the criteria list looks like, and each of the level 3 criteria has data associated with it. And what we did was when we overlaid it, you kind of created this spatial mapping that shows hot colors, which are our high priority areas for invasive species management. And when we simplify this map into 5 classes from, say, low to high priorities, depending on how many criteria is getting hit at each of these locations, we see all the red colors, red, orange, and yellow, mostly in our TRCA lands. That's what the green hatch lines are. So our priority areas are mostly in our conservation areas. That's where natural cover is. That's where our assets are. So it makes sense. So we can zoom into particular locations and then also do finer level prioritization within these properties as well. So this is an excellent tool for us, and we're going to continue to refine this with different weights as well. So this is my last slide. So with these 2 tools, we are now moving forward with the implementation of the strategy, where we are building partnerships and for effective implementation. In terms of framework itself, we are doing broader consultation with other stakeholders, finalizing these framework, finalizing the lists and areas, and then identifying a couple of actions that we're going to expand to in our next stages of this work. So just acknowledgement to our partners, and if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Namrata. We're out of time, unfortunately. I'm not sure if you're joining us again later. I know that Karen said she might be able to join us at the social, so people could contact you then with their questions. I thank both of you so much. This is a huge pile of work. We could spend a whole day just on this. So trying to summarize it down to a 20-minute presentation. So thank you so much for presenting.